Let me ask a question to all the hip-hop heads. Yeah, you. Who do you think is the godfather of hip-hop? Who first started delivering street poetry so rhythmically, so rapidly, and with so much depth and meaning that if you listen to it today, right now, you'd swear this person invented rap back in the early 70s.
There will be no pictures of pigs shooting down brothers on the instant replay.
Today, we're talking about the Black Bob Dylan, a man who became a symbol of the African American Revolution in the 70s and the 80s, a man who with a single song made people realize it was time to stand up, time to fight back against racism and oppression. Today, we're talking about Gil Scott-Heron, his life, music, and influence on the music we all love so much. So, without further ado, let's go! Gil Scott-Heron was born in Chicago. His father was a Jamaican professional footballer and his mom was an opera singer. But his parents split up when he was very young and he was sent to live with his grandmother in Tennessee. The years that shaped him were defined by the blues, a genre that was born right there in the South, and by his grandmother's upbringing. As a kid, Gil read a lot, and one of the authors he kept coming back to was Langston Hughes, one of the most important poets in African American culture and a central figure of the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 30s. This was one of the most explosive artistic movements in Black history, and it gave the world giants like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. When Gil turned 12, his mother, who'd already moved away, brought him to live with her in New York City. If Tennessee was the South and the blues, New York in the early 60s was jazz, street life, and a very stark contrast to the quiet small town he'd grown up in. Well, you might ask me how the hell he knows. He's never been in the 60s and he's never been to Tennessee or New York. Well, it's a secret. I don't know. Gil himself once said that the block he lived on was 85% Puerto Rican, 15% white, and him. On 17th Street, salsa music was everywhere, and it left a real mark on who he became as an artist. As a kid, he was absorbing different music, including blues, jazz. He particularly liked B.B. King and John Coltrane. In school, he was caught between two worlds, too literary and intellectual for the street and too different for the elite school crowd. After graduating, he enrolled at Lincoln University, the first university in the United States to award degrees to Black students. By the way, Langston Hughes had studied there. Gil was walking into a symbol of African American intellectual power. The atmosphere was revolutionary. The late 60s, the civil rights movement in full swing, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, Black activism at its absolute peak. And right in the middle of all that, a young Gil with something urgent to say. And it's at Lincoln University where a meeting happens that changes everything. Gil meets Brian Jackson, a musician and multi-instrumentalist who plays flute and keys. Jackson becomes his most important creative partner, and together they release some of the most iconic records in this story. Jackson brings something Gil's poetry was missing: a living, breathing, organic sound, and Gil gives Jackson poetic depth that he could never have reached alone. So it was a win-win situation. At the same time, Gil doesn't stop writing. In 1970, while still a student, he publishes his debut novel, The Vulture, a raw and honest portrait of street life in Harlem, of drugs and survival. And it's also in 1970 when his music career begins. But before, in the late 60s, a genre was emerging: spoken word, sometimes called poetic jazz, a form that grew out of the Black arts movement. But what is spoken word exactly? Spoken word is half sermon, half poetry, and it speaks directly to the urgent realities of African American life. It moves without a fixed melody. The tempo rises and falls with emotion and text, and this spoken word is like proto-rap. Listen for yourself.
In 1960, I was a Negro, and then Brother Malcolm came along, and then some nigger shot Malcolm down. But the bitter truth lives on.
The rappers of the 70s didn't have to invent anything. It was already there. The themes barely changed. What Gil Scott-Heron was saying about racism and dropping political lyrics in the late 60s is the same thing Grandmaster Flash and the Furious 5 were doing when Melly Mel came through with Broken Glass everywhere. Now you might be asking, why should I care about this guy? And I'll tell you straight. When hip-hop fans around the world listen to rap music, we often catch the familiar references: money, flexing, beef, the streets, but somewhere inside of all that, there is a small but absolutely critical piece of African American culture that you can only truly access by going back to the legends like Gil Scott-Heron, or for instance, Funkadelic, who I've already covered in a full video on this channel. Here. These artists from the 60s, 70s, and 80s literally created rap music. They laid the foundation for the hip-hop culture we love. So if you consider yourself a hip-hop fan, this video is for you. After watching this, the puzzle pieces start clicking into place. So next time you listen to Kendrick Lamar or J. Cole, you'll finally understand more about why their music sounds the way it does. At the very beginning of his recording career in 1970, Gil releases his first live album in the spoken word poetic jazz genre, Small Talk at 125th and Lenox. He reads poems in front of a live audience by minimal percussion. And Flying Dutchman Records captures it and releases it as a record. 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, that's the heart of Harlem, New York. On this record, Gil is talking about the hardest things: poverty, racism, social injustice. On Whitey on the Moon, he's furious that while Neil Armstrong is landing on the moon, black people in America are still living in poverty.
And still, while Whitey's on the moon. You know the man just upped my rent last night? Because Whitey's on the moon.
And I'll be honest with you, I'm a guy from Europe. I have absolutely no lived experience of what it means to be black in 1960s in the US. But you know, I still felt the struggles in my chest. I really enjoyed this album. And by the way, at the end of this video, I'm giving you a full tier list of all Gil Scott-Heron's solo and collaboration albums, so stay with me to find out which albums are must listens. Now, let's talk about Gil's first full music album, Pieces of a Man, released in 1971. Recorded in literally 2 days, it's one of the most important albums in the history of African American music, and just one of my favorite albums in general. If the debut Small Talk was raw spoken word, this is a full musical album where Gil's poetry only gets sharper and more powerful. This is where he realizes that his message lands hardest when it's accompanied by music. On Pieces of a Man, there are tracks that cut straight through the bone with their soul and emotion. But my personal favorites are Lady Day and John Coltrane, Home is Where the Hatred Is, and Pieces of a Man. The first one, and the title tells you, is about the legendary Billie Holiday and John Coltrane. Gil looks around and sees a world full of plastic people, plastic homes, and artificial happiness.
Could you call on John Coltrane now, 'cause they'll watch your troubles, your troubles, your troubles.
He sees the music of these great artists as the only thing that can save our world from total dehumanization. Home is Where the Hatred is told from the perspective of an addict returning home. And for him, home isn't warmth or safety, it's suffering and horror of dependency.
I left 3 days ago, but no one seems to know I'm gone.
The title is an antithesis to a saying, home is where the heart is. For this person, home is the place where the people who love him most look at him with pain and contempt. And what always struck me was that while so many artists at the time were writing the same love songs over and over and over again, Gil Scott-Heron was touching subjects nobody else dared to touch. The level of poetry here is on another level entirely. He says, home was once an empty vacuum that's filled with my silent screams. And then there is Pieces of a Man, the title track. The album's title comes from the image of a father who receives a notice from the mailman that he'd been fired, and he metaphorically collapses, breaks apart into small pieces. The story is told through the eyes of his son watching it happen. But this isn't just a story about losing a job. The context goes much deeper. This is a systemic metaphor, a portrait of how racial injustice literally dismantles a man's dignity. After everything this man has survived, this is the last straw. Gil describes the moment, how the father tries to hold on to his dignity, how his hat falls off, how the boy collects the pieces of the man with his eyes. And then the police arrive and take him away. But they're not taking a man. They're taking his fragments. Because he's no longer a whole.
He was always such a good man.
my absolute favorite song in Gil's entire catalog. In 1974, Winter in America drops. Brian Jackson is officially credited for the first time. Gil had moved to a different label after the director of his old one refused to put his partner's name on the cover. The album title is a metaphor. After the assassinations of Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., who represented spring and summer, winter had arrived. The album sounds beautiful, a blend of blues, jazz and soul, Gil's poetry over Jackson's piano, which I could honestly listen to forever. From this album I love Rivers of My Fathers, The Bottle, and the title track itself. Rivers of My Fathers does something to me every time. Gil uses the image of the river, one of the most powerful metaphors in African American culture, symbolizing freedom, home and salvation. Rivers of my fathers, could you carry me home? I know, it's bad. Fucking hell. The Bottle is the album's most important single. Upbeat rhythm, Jackson on flute and electric piano, but underneath that joyful sound, alcoholism. A song about addiction, abortion, incarceration in the ghetto, dressed up in a danceable groove.
You see that black boy over there running scared? His old man in a bottle.
The contrast is something else. And the title track Winter in America captures what the whole album is about. An America where all hope has been lost. No real democracy, no real protest, just a country grinding through its final days. Feels very relevant, honestly. After the success of Winter in America, legendary producer Clive Davis signs the duo to Arista Records, one of the most powerful labels of that era. Now, conscious jazz could reach a much wider audience, and for Gil's protest ideas, that was everything. The two were given full creative freedom and together released 6 albums. In 1975, From South Africa to South Carolina drops. 1974-75 was the height of apartheid in the South Africa, a brutal regime of racial segregation. Black people stripped of basic rights. The international anti-apartheid movement hadn't yet built up real steam, and Gil Scott-Heron and Brian Jackson were already making an album about it. This release is about racism as a global condition, from South Africa to South Carolina, 2 places of racial oppression separated by an ocean, but connected by the same pain. The album sounds different from the earlier records. More experimentation, more solos, Jackson singing more, funk and soul taking over as the dominant sound. And the centerpiece is the song Johannesburg.
Tell me, brother, have you heard from Johannesburg?
On this track, Gil asks, "What's the word? Tell me, brother, have you heard from Johannesburg?" And he paints a picture of apartheid terror. Johannesburg became an anthem of the anti-apartheid movement in the United States before most American politicians even dared to openly criticize the South African government. It played at rallies, it moved through radio stations, and Gil positioned himself as the leading socio-political voice in African American music. In 1977, the duo releases Bridges. This is the album where a radical new technological element changes their sound completely. The Tonto synthesizer and its builder Malcolm Cecil. Tonto is the world's largest multi-timbral modular synthesizer. Well, basically it's this massive thing covered in hundreds of knobs, wires and levers, like the control panel of a spaceship. It was used on some of Stevie Wonder's most iconic records, Inner Visions, Fulfillingness, First Finale, and thanks to Tonto, the sound on this album is completely different. More acidic, more futuristic. Especially on the album's centerpiece, We Almost Lost Detroit.
We've almost lost Detroit.
This song is about the 1966 partial meltdown of a nuclear reactor near Detroit that was hidden from the public. Gil Scott-Heron calls politicians to account. Nuclear industry in the US was ramping up hard in the 70s, and in true Gil Scott-Heron fashion, he dropped a political record about exactly what mattered at that moment. This song remains one of the defining cultural documents of the anti-nuclear movement in music, and it lives on in the samples of conscious rap artists from Black Star to Common. The 1978 Secrets brings together political and social lyrics, critiques of the advertising industry, show business, drug addiction, incarceration, and more. There is a growing creative tension between Gil, who's trying to put the lyrics in the center of the album, and Brian Jackson, who wants to explore and experiment with music even more. Despite that tension, Secrets alongside Bridges and the upcoming 1980 album form nothing short of a golden era for the duo. The central highlight is the song Angel Dust.
He was grooving.
PCP, or phencyclidine, was a street drug spreading rapidly through black communities in the late 70s. Gil Scott-Heron paints the portrait of a person being destroyed by this drug from the inside. This track was a triumph, an incredible piece of music that went on to be sampled by many rappers. And then comes 1980, the year and the album with the same name. This album, as I always felt, sounded like Gil and Brian Jackson understood each other on a cellular level. Their harmony seeps through every single song. But it turns out that 1980 was actually their final collaboration, torn apart by serious creative differences. Gil was increasingly pushing the music direction his way, gradually reducing Jackson to the role of an arranger, and his drug addiction was making everything even worse. The crack and cocaine era was pulling him deeper and deeper into a hole. What's incredible is how stunning 1980 sounds to me, and how terrible things actually were behind the scenes. Arrests, imprisonment, losing his creative edge, literally losing his teeth. On 1980, the duo continued moving away from Afrocentric elements towards disco and futuristic sound. And if we're talking futuristic, just look at that album cover. Ugh, that's a real vibe. I really love it. Brian Jackson said the theme of this album came from the feeling that with the arrival of the 80s, the hope for a peaceful, socially just, and environmentally friendly future was fading away. The Orwellian 1984 was approaching, and it was genuinely frightening. 1969 had been peak hope. The civil rights movement, Black power on the rise. By 1975, things were harder, but the Vietnam War had ended and some hope remained. But in 1980, it felt like all hope had vanished, and that's what the title track is about.
And there ain't even no way back to 75, much less 1960.
The abandonment of the African American movement, cultural appropriation, very real, very heavy. And Willing is another track I deeply love. It's Gil Scott's personal philosophy, reflections on a person's willingness to keep pushing through every hardship life throws at them. His songs are like bricks he lays on his own path forward, a track about personal resilience and unbreakable will.
My life really means is that the songs that I sing are just pieces of a dream that I've been.
1980 is the farewell album of the duo, filled with dread about the new decade, and it ends the greatest creative partnership in Gil's life, and at the same time it was one of the best albums of the duo musically. After this, Gil Scott-Heron's music was never quite as brilliant again, with one extraordinary exception, which I'll get into in a moment. After 1980, Gil records 3 solo albums. The most interesting is Reflections, released in 1981, and it was released in the same year Ronald Reagan was elected president. Gil Scott-Heron once again turned social anxiety into art. The album has 2 essential tracks of that era, Gun and B-Movie. Gun tells the story of a person in the ghetto who decides to buy a weapon for self-defense because everyone around is armed and the danger is completely real. And then there is the spoken word track B-Movie, a genuine masterpiece of political poetry. Gil Scott-Heron drops a full 12-minute diss track on President Ronald Reagan and does a mic drop. 12 minutes of absolutely demolishing and dismantling a politician he felt had no business being in the White House.
Because all of a sudden we have fallen prey to selective amnesia, remembering what we want to remember.
Gil draws a parallel between Hollywood and American politics. Reagan, or Ray-Gun, as he sarcastically calls him, is an actor playing the president. But this isn't a role anymore, it's the power. The title B-Movie means a cheap, Bad Phil. And that, Gil Scott-Heron says, is the fate waiting for all Americans. This track could be analyzed for hours and you'd still miss layers of context because it's packed with the political realities and humor of that era. I genuinely believe that if Gil had been born a generation later, he would have been one of the greatest MCs of his time, and maybe he'd have joined Public Enemy. Then in the mid-80s, Gil Scott-Heron begins using crack cocaine and falls into even deeper addiction. His partner tried desperate measures to reach him, photographing him unconscious and taping the photos to the walls, but he refused to look at them. A man who just a decade earlier was considered one of the leading African-American poets of his generation looked exhausted and broken. Drugs consumed years that could have been the most powerful and mature of his creative life. And this nightmare continues for 12 years, until out of almost nowhere in 1994 he rises and releases the album Spirits. Oh god, what an album. You'd think, what kind of comeback are we actually talking about? What amazing songs could be there at this point? But Spirits is proof that no amount of lost years can stop an artist from finding their voice again. Sonically, the album leans more into jazz than his early 80s work, a return to the roots, to black poetry over jazz music. And yeah, Gil Scott-Heron had lost some of his voice. He doesn't hit the same peaks he once did, but what I believe is the most important quality on this album remained completely intact. And that quality is his soul. And it somehow survived years of darkness and addiction and poured itself directly onto this record. The album opens with the track Message to the Messenger, the godfather of hip-hop, speaking directly to the rappers of 1994 in the spoken word tradition. Gil Scott-Heron sends a warning. The voice in rap music is a weapon, and it can't be wielded carelessly. He condemns the glorification of guns and violence, misogyny, the ethical failures that every rap artist is responsible for. Gil reminds the world that hip-hop grew out of the traditions of soul, blues, and spoken word. He's basically saying, yo, you came from me. I came from the people like John Coltrane, B.B. King, Billie Holiday. So don't forget your roots and take responsibility for your words, because a new generation is growing up listening to you. The next track, Spirits, is the best song on the album. It's an interpretation of John Coltrane's Equinox. The idea of equinox was a moment of balance between darkness and light. The word equinox meaning the point where day and night are equal. And Gil Scott-Heron takes Coltrane's metaphor into his own interior world and speaks about the state of a soul that has survived years of darkness and is now searching for its point of balance. The album doesn't end there. There are deeply soulful and romantic tracks like Give Her a Call and Lady's Song, and the trilogy The Other Side, about addiction. Spirits is genuinely a musical miracle. Nobody was expecting to hear from Gil Scott-Heron again, and he came through, and with such a masterpiece. After 1994, Gil falls back into addiction. Arrests, 2 prison sentences, an HIV diagnosis in 2007. In 2010, once again, unexpectedly, out of nothing, the album I Knew Here comes out. Critics receive it warmly, but his health is in constant decline. He goes on a European tour, but at some point, his body simply can't hold on. On May 27th, 2011, Gil Scott-Heron died in New York City. He was 62 years old. Death took someone who was far more than just a singer. Gil Scott-Heron was a poet, a prophet, a revolutionary all-in-one. In the late 60s, he picked up the word as a weapon and permanently changed how we understand music and the social responsibility of the artist. He told his truth when most people stayed silent. He wrote about things nobody else would touch. He made an enormous contribution to the development of hip-hop and was simply unlike anyone else of his time. His legacy is the foundation on which all conscious hip-hop stands. Long before Grandmaster Melly Mel or Run DMC ever picked up a microphone, Gil Scott-Heron was already delivering rhythmic street poetry with real depth, and modern rappers are still learning from him. You might never hear this man's name ever again after this video, but I hope this gave you a deeper understanding of how our favorite genre of music came into existence. And finally, as I promised, a full tier list of Gil Scott-Heron's solo and collabo albums, so you know exactly where to start. I'm new here. Yeah, this album didn't move me much at all. Moving Target, you feel this musical weakness and Gil's exhaustion from the creative process. And Free Will, also not my favorite, and honestly a bit too much flute for me. All three albums go to tier D. The first minute of A New Day, Real Eyes and Reflections, solid but not extraordinary. Same goes for Small Talk at 125th and Lenox. It's almost entirely poetry rather than music. And It's Your World, which is half live tracks and half original material. So all of these go to tier C. Bridges, From South Africa to South Carolina, and Secrets, I would put them all in tier B. The first is a great album with constant synth experimentation. The second is Gil and Brian at their most Afrocentric. And the third is strong, both musically and lyrically. 1980 is gorgeous sonically and lyrically captures the anxiety before seismic change. Spirits is the phenomenal comeback, and Winter in America is an exceptional record that helped the duo announce themselves to the world. So let's place these three albums in tier A. And finally, one album only would go to tier S, and it's Pieces of a Man, the most important and most influential work in Gil Scott-Heron's catalog. Almost everything on it is at the absolute highest level. I recommend it to everyone, no exceptions. Okay, and as always, you'll see 2 more videos from my channel. Click on one of them, you'll enjoy it. And that's it from me. I'm out.